Good morning. Good morning. How is everybody? Good. Tom's good. Is anybody else good? Hopefully that's not a sign that you'll be better once this is over. Well, it is, sorry, I'm knocking everything down. It is an honor and a privilege to be in front of you here this morning. For those of you who don't know, you saw Tom last week, and we look similar. We both have beards. He's smarter, more patient, but I think as he discussed as I watched the class, we will be co-studying this with you this quarter. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Todd Armstrong, and we've been back here about 7 years since we moved away and then came back. We had to take a hiatus to Indiana, for those that don't know, for 12 years to learn that it's better to live here than there. But we learned. So I really do appreciate, and I do want to say, I think maybe in the spirit of the opening of this letter that Paul writes to the church at Colossae. He didn't ask me to do this, but for those of you that don't know Tom, he's a wonderful teacher. He's a wonderful man. And if you don't know him, there is one word, and I have told him this before, that comes to my mind when I think of Tom, and that is encourager. So I want to thank you for that, Tom. And if you haven't experienced that, talk to him today, and you will leave feeling encouraged after you talk with him. So Tom, thank you. That's all you needed, right? That's all you needed. Another piece of introduction I think that's important, it has nothing to do with me, but it's about where I just came from last quarter. So last quarter, I was teaching our middle school class, and I want you to know how wonderful those young people are. At the same time, I think this interaction might be a little different, maybe. So if I default to rules or limitations, you'll know that I've defaulted back to middle school class. But Chuck, thank you for doing that. As Tom mentioned last week, we will be we have an error. We will be leading a song, or he will be leading a song before every class, as a way to kind of unify us as a group, as a family. Thank you. And to work through that. So here is our class outline. Tom showed you this last week, but I think it's important to come back to this outline. As you will see, we are not going to go through Colossians from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 4, verse 18 in linear order. So for those of you who are linear processors and linear thinkers, bear with us this quarter, but we're going to go through topics and themes through this book and hopefully lead through this. And this is where we will be today, looking at the supremacy of Christ. So if you have your Bibles, please turn to Colossians chapter 1, and we will be looking at verse 15 here in just a second. It's important before we jump into these verses to review just a bit what Tom did last week. And I would present to you that this letter that Paul writes to the church in Colossae is a Jesus-centric or Jesus-focused letter. Jesus is at the heart and at the theme of this entire letter. And as Tom mentioned, this was I guess the scholars believe this was written in the early 60s AD, or of the Common Era, when Paul was imprisoned in Rome. And it's a part of what is called the prison letters, which would also include the letters to the Ephesians, to the Philippians, as well as Philemon. And so that was when it was written. We also know that as if you look here, if you look at verse 4 in chapter 1, verse 7, verse 9, the language tells us that Paul had not been to Colossae. He didn't plant this church, but he had heard. And potentially he had trained a young man who had come back named Epaphras and told him about this congregation, of what he had heard, of Paul, what he had heard from Epaphras, of what was going on there. And there's a strong message in this, but I think there's a bit of uncertainty, if you'll allow me to say that. And that uncertainty is, if you look in the first part of this letter, Paul is encouraging them. Is he encouraging them just because they're doing great? Is he warning them of things that may be going on that they need to watch out for? There isn't a mention of a specific heresy or misteaching there, but there's some potential warnings in this first part, or encouraging of things to do and to watch out for. And one scholar, as reading over the previous months here, is potentially Colossae maybe was not as significant of a town, if you will, as some of the others, but you passed through to get through significant places. So there was a lot of things moving through Colossae. People, cultures, temptations, pressures, other teachings, we could fill in the blank. And one scholar said that potentially these Christians at the church were maybe being pushed by the culture to move away from Jesus. Or were being asked to think of, well, Jesus is good, but is he enough? Do you want more? Should there be something else? And as I reflected on that, is that any different than what's hitting us today? It may not sound someone come up to you and say, really, is Jesus enough? They may not use those words. But we may be tempted to add to or say, well, Jesus fits here. I'm not sure he fits here. And so I would propose to you as we go through this that this is relevant to us today. Very relevant to us. And that the theme of this book, of this letter, and I will use these words, is that Jesus is enough. Jesus is who we need. And that the word preeminence, I had to look that up because it's not a word that I use in my daily life. But Jesus is preeminent. I believe that was on this slide, actually. Yes, the preeminence of Christ. I applaud Tom. He probably knew what the word meant. I had to look it up. But when you look at this, it's first in everything. First in importance. First in honor. And Jesus is everything that we need. So as we go through these verses today, I want you to look for a word. I want you to look for a word, all. A-L-L, all. So as we come to verse 15, and we come to this part, verses 15 to 19, this passage that we will read here is central to this book, or to this letter. And as mentioned, Paul kind of walked through an introduction to the church, to the Christians. A letter that was read, which he says here in the latter part of this book. It was read out loud. And he talks and gives them encouragement. And then he jumps to what is a big punch. I don't know, back then they didn't have icons or emoticons or things to put in a letter, but this is the meat, the excitement of the letter. And so if I get excited up here, join with me. If not, just smile and act like there's something here, because these are powerful verses. And it's more poetic. And it was thought that this was a hymn from back in the early church that was sang. And so here's what I hope when we leave today we will have studied. First, I hope we will see that the person of Christ, the man of Christ, is described as one who is the image of the invisible God, which we will see in verse 15, and that in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Number two, the Lord with which we are redeemed is the one through whom you and the entire world were created. 3, Jesus is not only Lord of the church, but he's also the creator, and he's the ruler of everything. And for us to think about, we may think that today is the worst that it's ever been, and what are we going to do with our children? What's going to happen to our grandchildren? And I would attest to you that these thoughts have been in existence back when our great-great-grandparents thought about their children. And that our world today seems messed up. Our world today seems to be without God. There was news this week about evil in Georgia. We're concerned about things in November. Some of us are concerned about what happens when we leave here. But I want you to know right here we will see that the Lord is still in control. And in verse 17, everything is held together through Jesus. When we leave here today, when we end, this is where we will come back to, where I hope we will come back. So here's what we're going to jump into, and I'll go ahead and begin in verse 15, and I will read through this. Oh, as mentioned last week, we will be reading from the English Standard Version, which is what I have. There will be times I will pull, even in this class, from a different version, and I will let you know when I do that, but if I don't, it'll be from the ESV. So chapter 1, verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. So let's look at verse 15. Let's start there, where it says, he is the image of the invisible God. And so I want to ask you a question, more for you to think about. If you choose to answer, that's okay. But I want you to sit on this, and we'll come back in just a few minutes to that. So today, what image for you defines the good life? Maybe to present it in a different way, I would say to you that our society, the world that we live in, everything we're faced with, sells us an image. Sells us something. And in fact, all of us pattern our life after some image or some piece. So I want you to hold on to that. Just reflect on, what is that for you? Or what has that been for you? So if we look at the word image here, I'm not a Greek scholar, but if we think of the Greek of this word, the Latin, where it comes through the Latin word, we get the word icon from this word, from image. So he is the image of the invisible God, meaning Jesus. In the New Living Translation, I actually like the translation of this verse better. There, where it says, he is the visible image of the invisible God. Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. And as we look, we see the image, we see the likeness, we see the resemblance of the invisible God in Jesus. So if you'll go with me, you can turn, or you can just It's something you already know. You don't even have to turn. But if you go think about Genesis 1. Think about verse 26. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And then in verse 27, it continues where God says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." So, as I thought through this, I came to, no one's seen God. But we just read that we were created in God's image. Paul writes that Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. So we see the image, the likeness, and the resemblance of the invisible God in Jesus. So I come back to the question that I asked you. What image do we live our lives for? Do we want to be? And I would present to you the answer to this question is, from the beginning, we were made to mirror our lives after Jesus. Because in Jesus, we see God. And so Paul is reminding the Christians in Colossae, as he read this, that Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. And today that we as Christians created in God's image, a God we can't see, but we know, and we have been cleansed by Jesus. And he's the visible image of the invisible God. In the second part of this verse, Paul gives us the word, the firstborn of all creation. And so this firstborn is more of a special position or a special status versus being, as would be the literal translation of this word, that he's the firstborn. So it's a figurative use of this word. And in John chapter 1, if we go back to his gospel, he was in the beginning with God. Right? He was there. Through him all things were created. So we know that Jesus is the source of all that has been created. So he is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn of all creation. In 16, here in verse 16, Paul writes, or he follows with, he is the visible image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And then he starts 4, leading back to this verse. Because he's the firstborn, because of this, by him all things were created. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And if you will, have you ever thought about the magnitude of this? I really hadn't, I'll be honest, until I was studying and preparing for this over the past several months. This one verse. Have you thought about the magnitude of this? So if you will, I want you to come with me just to the other side. I want you to come on a journey with me for a minute. I invite you to come. And I want you to think about something. I'm going to ask you to think about some things that I reflected on. And I would love for you to be wowed with me. I would love that. So let's just think for just a second. He's the creator of all things. Anybody seen a caterpillar? Or is one of our children called a calipitter? Did you know that in a caterpillar, I gotta make sure I say it right, in a caterpillar, in its head, it has over 200 muscles in its head? Caterpillar. Thank you. Did you know there's over 1,000 different varieties of bananas? Why? There's about 100 different varieties of cucumbers. Now, some of you are going to come to me after class and say, well, Todd, some of that is due to plant breeding and plant genetics and hybrid vigor, and talk through all the, and you're right. So explain this to me. Have you thought about the diversity of laughter of people? Have you thought about it? Some people just quiet. Some people snort. Some chuckle. I think our oldest daughter uses the word chortle. I don't know what that means. Some like belly laugh. Have you thought about that? Did you know that a mature elm tree produces over 5 million leaves in one season? Why don't spiders stick to their own web? Did you know that plants take in carbon dioxide that hurts us and produces oxygen which helps us? And you may go, why is he saying this? Because God did all this. And we could go on for hours. And I really want you to be wowed by this. God created everything, all things. And I would believe why he did that is because he wants us to worship him. He wants us to be wowed by him. He wants us to honor him. For by him all things were created. All things. In heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. So if you think about related passages, I know in John chapter 1 we talked about that. It's in 1 Corinthians, also in the letter to the Hebrews, where it also mentions that everything was created through Jesus. Everything. And I want us to pause and to be wowed by that. And he is before all things in verse 17, and in him all things hold together. If you have put your finger here, we have mentioned it, but if you can turn to John chapter 1, the Gospel of John chapter 1. All of you, or if not all of you, many of you could recite this to me, but it's worth reading here together. In the Gospel of John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So when everything began, Jesus already existed. Do you guys hear a high-pitched, thank you. I was about ready to call Dr. Shattuck up here because I thought I was hearing something. So, when everything began, Jesus already existed. And he is before all things. And in him, all things hold together. Everything imaginable was created by Christ with God and is now under the authority of Jesus. And as I said earlier, the last part, or as we started the class, the last part of this verse, and in him all things hold together. I'm really not interested in getting into what is going on in the world and what's happening or what will happen or what could happen. But we know we live in a lawless world. We know we live in a place that we see things and it breaks our heart. We hear things and we wonder why. And we read that He created everything. And how can all this happen? Paul writes to us, and in many other places, in Him all things hold together. So even though we seem messed up, well, you could say we are. Even though we live in a world that every day is pushing God further and further away, Jesus is still in control. And Jesus holds all things together. And if you think about this letter that's being written to the church in Colossae that we're now reading here, Paul has just written to them in verse 15, verse 16, and verse 17. He tells them, as I said, he kind of gives this big punch. He starts the letter with, I'm encouraging you to stay strong in what you've heard. I'm encouraging you I'm proud of you, keep going. And he says, by the way, Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn of all creation. He created everything. And He's before all things, and He holds it all together. And today, as we read this, that should give us some happiness, some joy. And as Mr. Elder said, wow, which I appreciate. And when you look at these verses, I told you it was a bit of a poem. There's a bit of a break here in this poem, or a change. These first verses, Paul was writing and describing about what was created, and that Jesus was at the center of all of that creation. And he shifts, and he starts to talk about Jesus is bringing us a new creation. Our hope or our future of what's here. And you'll see some parallels. I'm really not good at poetry, so I didn't try to parallel these things because I just don't get it. But that's what all the commentaries say. There's a lot of poetry here, and maybe you'll catch it. Then he switches. Yes, sir?
It's remarkable when you read in this particular section, the letter to Colossae, and given the environment that those people were living under at that time, emperor worship and deity and all these images of statues around them who they believe is a god and things of that nature, and the fact that even Caesar felt himself to be a god and be worshipped. And then I have Paul put this in their faces. Okay, you believe that. Let me give you the truth. Here's this image of who really is in charge. That triumphant entry of the Messiah, the man who's really in charge. That's the remarkable thing, which you have to look at it. How do those people see this? Mm-hmm. How they hear it, given what they were experiencing with the Diana worship and everything else at the same time.
Very well stated. And if you will allow me, I will add on to, we may not have statues of gods and things that we walk out and see, but it's very similar to what we're faced with today. And the letter, that what you described is how it's relevant to that church there. Everything you just said applied in today's words is relevant to us here today. That we're bombarded with political figures or business figures or other religions or accept everything and everything is good. We're bombarded with what you just said, Christ is number one. And so I appreciate you saying that, because the relevance of this letter to the church at Colossae is exactly what you said, and the relevance to us today is very powerful. And so we've just looked at this creation piece, and that Christ was right there at the center of it all, created for and through him. And Paul then switches to a verse that packs a ton into one verse. In verse 18. Where he says, and he. And remember, there's a poetic transition here that people claim that happens. And he is the head of the body, the church. So he's not talking about what was created. He's the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning. He is the firstborn from the dead. That in everything he might be preeminent. That he might be first. Yes?
Think about that word preeminence. It's not only just first what? And I said, he's first, but what is he first in? We know he's God. We know he's first in reference to the verses that we're reading. But as we read in Genesis, and as we read in John a moment ago, we look at the Greek again, and there's an origin of the word preeminence from another Greek word. And it's actually explained and made me understand that he is first in time and in beginning. Jesus was I am, and I was. He's always been. And it's really hard to get the people of the time then to understand that.
Is it easy for us today to understand that?
That's my point. Also now.
Right.
Especially the letters that we've written. These words are difficult for us to understand sometimes. And it's just like a wow to them, like it's like a lightning bolt over their head for them to understand that he's trying to get them to realize the statutes and things that were just mentioned a minute ago. They were just created. They were just formed. Well, Jesus was already there.
It's awesome.
Long
Isn't it?
before any of that nonsense was created or thought of.
And you think about that. I appreciate you giving more of that background of the word preeminent. It's not just that he's first over everything. He is first. He's first of the first, right? He was I am. He was the beginning. Yeah. He was there. Yes.
Over this, something that jumped out at me as it came out of verse 16. It says, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. And after the comma, it goes on to say whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. Who are those people? They could be anybody. They could be the good rulers, they could be the bad rulers, it could be, it's everybody, anybody, it's all. So those are the people that we waste some of our time worrying about. When in point of fact, they're under Christ. Will they see justice for them in this world or the one to come? That's not ours to solve.
That's right.
But they are under him whether they like it or not. And it's encouraging to me to know that I don't have to worry about that. I just have to worry about how am I doing? What am I doing to follow the image of Christ? No, that doesn't matter.
There is a piece of that part of verse 16 where all I can do is sit and wonder. But when he says all things were created, and when he says all things in heaven on earth, all things visible and invisible. So what does that not include? But then he calls out what you just said. Why? Because that's already covered in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. That's already covered. But then he specifies thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities. Maybe we're supposed to pay attention to that specifically. not just then, but also for us today. And so, there is really the only thing we can control is ourselves and where we are placing our focus on that. So here in verse 18, where Paul writes, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. And I'm sure there could be a class just on this verse alone. If you look at these three things, that Christ is the head of the church. Christ is the firstborn from the dead. And Christ has supremacy over all things. Those are three powerful things in one verse. Christ is the head of the church. We know, but it's worth stating that we don't have an earthly headquarters. Christ is the head of the church. And Paul writes about that also in his letter to the Ephesians in chapter 1 and again in chapter 5, that Jesus is the head. Jesus is the head of the body, the church, which is us. And if you think about it in a bodily form, the head controls the body, is over the body. Jesus is the head of the church. He's the beginning, as was mentioned. He's first. He's the beginning. We just read he was visible image of the invisible God, the firstborn of creation. And here he says he's the firstborn from the dead. I can see that parallel, maybe, in poetry. Here, the firstborn from the dead. If you turn to 1 Corinthians, another letter that Paul wrote in chapter 15. So we certainly know, and we could walk through that Jesus wasn't the first to be risen from the dead, because he raised people from the dead, and we read about that, and we've studied that. So again, it's not necessarily a literal wording, but a figurative learning, in that Jesus was the first to be resurrected to die no more. Paul writes to the Corinthians in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, if you're in verse 22. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. And in verse 23, but each in his own order. Christ, the firstfruits, then at his coming, those who belong to Christ. So he is the firstborn from the dead, the first to be resurrected from the dead to die no more. And as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, and then at his coming, those who belong to Christ. It's pretty encouraging, I think. And then the third thing in this verse that Paul brings to us is that he says that in everything he might be preeminent. That Christ has supremacy over all things. So if Christ is first and supreme over everything, which is the physical and spiritual realms, he's first over the church, he's first over death, he's over everything. And when Jesus ascended to heaven, he was placed over every earthly and heavenly power. He was placed over everything. Paul writes to the Ephesians in chapter 1, beginning in verse 20. that he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And he put all things under his feet, and gave him as head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. And in 1 Peter, we also see in chapter 3 and in verse 22. Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. That Jesus has supremacy over all things. And then we come to verse 19. For that in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. So the 4 relates back to the previous verse of about Jesus. That when we think about that, you say he's head of the church, he's firstborn from the dead, he's preeminent over everything, that for him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And this fullness is like a completeness. And not a one-time completeness, but a continual fullness, a continual completeness. And that God's divine purpose is achieved here in Jesus. In the Colossians here, what I have in yellow, if colors are hard for you to see, it's the last bullet, or the last 2 bullets. The Colossians did not need to turn to anyone other than Jesus. He meets every need of the inhabitants on this earth. And the same is true for us today. And I asked you to think about the word all in these verses. And I want you to think about, wow, he just encouraged them. And then he brings to them these verses. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And as we close today, the person of Christ is described as the image of the invisible God. Or as the New Living Translation says, the visible image of the invisible God, in whom all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And don't forget that we were created in God's image, who we can't see, but we can see Jesus. And so who are we to strive to be like and after? And the Lord through whom we are redeemed is the one through whom everything was created. Everything. And Jesus is not only the Lord of the church, but he's also the creator and the ruler of all things. And even though we may worry and be concerned, we are held together through Jesus. He is still in control. And as much as that was true back in the early 60s AD of the Common Era, it is true today in September of 2024. It hasn't changed. Thanks for listening.